Okay, let's unpack this. Today we are taking a deep dive into one extraordinary piece of writing. It's a chapter called Bernhardsdorp, and it's where the legendary biologist E.O. Wilson really lays the groundwork for his most famous idea, biophilia.
And if you're just encountering Wilson, biophilia is this idea that humans have an innate, a genetically coded connection to the living world. This chapter is so important because it uses one specific place, the Surinam rainforest, to connect our psychology, that feeling of wonder, with the cold, hard facts of biology.
Exactly. And what's so great about it is that it's not some dry academic paper, it's a personal story. He uses these incredible sensory details to show us this conflict he's obsessed with.
The conflict between our deep evolutionary past in nature and our modern engineered world, what he calls the machine.
Yeah, the machine in the garden.
And Bernhardsdorp is the perfect place to explore that. The things he sees there, they just force you to confront this tension right away.
So let's start with this setting because he paints such a picture. It's Bernhardsdorp, Suriname, an ordinary tropical morning. The sunlight is harsh, the air is thick, humid. He talks about this landscape rising from these crystalline white sands, little islands of forest and glades.
And this all leads towards the real heart of the place, the triple canopied rainforest. But before he even gets there, he looks at the village itself. Just 10 simple one-room huts with these palm leaf walls.
And there's a woman there, stirring a fire with a machete, barefoot, plump, wearing this floral print dress. But here's the key point Wilson makes. The village might look simple, but the culture isn't pure. It's already been changed by colonial Dutch influence, by cheap manufactured goods. The machine has already gotten there.
Which brings us to this really powerful metaphor, the captive messenger. Under one of the houses, there's a tame collared peccary, and Wilson looks at it with a biologist's eye, noting the coarse fur, the pale neck stripe.
Right, the taxonomist's eye. And this peccary, it seems pretty unremarkable at first, doesn't it? But then you learn what peccaries are actually like. They're incredibly smart, right?
Oh, their intelligence is fascinating. Some biologists put them up there with elephants and porpoises, maybe even smarter than some dogs. They don't just wander around, they patrol in these organized herds, almost like wolves.
So they're not like typical herd animals.
Not at all. They recognize each other, and the females are dominant, which is unusual. They're these highly organized, formidable little creatures.
And yet, here's this one. Captured as an infant, totally tame. Its whole complex social life. Just gone, stunted.
Yeah, and Wilson says he feels this uneasiness, even embarrassment. Because here is this perfect anatomical specimen, but it's stripped of its purpose. He calls it a mute speaker trapped inside the unnatural clearing.
That feeling of embarrassment is really the hook, isn't it? Is the discomfort of seeing nature's complexity diminished by us. The village is the machine that's holding the peccary.
Exactly. And that feeling is what drives him away from the village and into the forest, to his real purpose for being there, which is to study ants and social insects.
Which he says is no trivial task. And you can see why. I mean, a single square mile of that forest can have over 100 species of ants and termites alone.
And let's just pause on that for a second, because this next stat is just mind-blowing. When scientists go into a patch of forest and weigh all the animals,
Everything, from the jaguars down to the worms.
everything, 1/3 of that entire weight, the total biomass, is just ants and termites.
One third, I can't even picture that. So the world is basically run by insects.
Functionally, yes. They are the chief predators, the key decomposers. They form this huge energy network. Wilson spells it out. Sunlight to leaf to caterpillar to ant to anteater to jaguar. It's this massive conduit for energy.
So the biologist has to dive into that network.
Yeah.
And we get this great image of him with his tools. Camera, satchel, jars of alcohol, hand lens, and this sweat-plastered khaki shirt.
Right. And he has this equipment because his whole perspective is different from what he calls the urbanophile. For most people, a jungle is a barrier, something to get through. For the naturalist, it's the destination. Towns are the weird labyrinths we built later.
He has that amazing anecdote to back this up.
The one in Jerusalem, it's so unexpected. He's standing near Solomon's throne, a place packed with thousands of years of human history. And what does he do? He gets down on his knees to watch the ants.
Because of that line from the Old Testament, right?
Yeah.
Go to the ant, thou sluggard.
Mm-hmm. And he realizes these ants are doing the exact same thing they were doing 3,000 years ago. For him, the million-year biological history of that place is just as compelling as the recent human part. And that's the mindset he takes into the Surinam forest.
So he steps out of the sun and into the cool shade of the forest. and he enters what he calls the naturalist's trance.
It's a kind of intense focus. He narrows his world down to just a few meters, looking for these tiny, hidden organisms.
But then this paradox hits him.
Yeah, the paradox of alienation. He's totally focused, totally connected, but at the same time, he realizes how little human passions matter there. Love, hate, ambition, it's all meaningless. History has no people. He says he feels like a transient of no consequence.
In a world that he loves, but that is also deeply alien, that's a powerful idea. He calls the forest floor a biological maelstrom. You see all this life, but you know that millions of unseen things are dying every second.
And their bodies are recycled instantly, broken down into what he calls clean biochemical chops to make new life. It shows how interconnected everything is, these intricate symbioses.
Which makes the whole system so vulnerable. He says if you pull out just one species of tree, the whole thing could collapse, like pulling the keystone from an arch.
And he gives a perfect example of this kind of extreme specialization. It's the relationship between the three-toed sloth and its own personal moth, Cryptosis colobus.
This is one of my favorite parts. It's so wonderfully weird. Tell us how it works.
Okay, so the sloth only comes down from the canopy to defecate about once a week.
A very predictable schedule.
Airy. And at that exact moment, the female moths, which live in the sloth's fur, fly out and lay their eggs on the fresh dung. The larvae feed there, grow up, and then fly back into the canopy to find a new sloth. The moth is found nowhere else on Earth.
That's just marvelous. It's this tiny moth that's found a way to avoid all competition by sinking its entire life to a sloth's bowel movements.
Exactly. And that brings us back to biophilia. This incredible diversity, which existed long before us, is what the restless part of our human spirit is drawn to. The search for knowledge just deepens the mystery. It's a catalytic reaction, he says.
He connects this feeling to those big romantic paintings of the American West. You know, like Albert Bierstadt's paintings of Yosemite. They feel safe, empty, like a refuge.
But that romantic ideal leads right into the tragedy, the machine in the garden. Wilson just says it plainly. We are killing the thing we love. We're caught between our love for the forest and our need for the city, the machine.
And the reality of being in nature isn't romantic at all, is it? Especially for a field biologist. He calls the jungle a living sea full of miniature horrors.
You really get a sense of the constant danger. He lists all the medical threats, arboviruses.
They give you chills and diarrhea. Then there's breakbone fever,
Vicious skin ulcers, the assassin bugs that spread Chagas's disease.
which he calls one of history's most unfair exchanges.
Leishmaniasis, schistosomiasis, malaria, yellow fever. The list just goes on. Evolution has found 1,000 ways to kill you.
It's terrifying. And he says this is the key. Our ancestors didn't have this dilemma. They just tried to survive. But for us, needing both nature and the machine was a good survival strategy. It made our brains bigger, our culture richer. Now, though, we've just accelerated toward the machine, and we're forgetting about the other side.
It sounds like a problem with no solution. But then Wilson pivots. He says the knowledge that created the problem also holds the solution. And this is where he brings in the microscope.
Right. He describes the simple act of scooping up a handful of dirt and leaves onto a white cloth. And he says this unprepossessing lump has more order in history than the surfaces of all the other lifeless planets combined.
It's a whole new universe. When you look closer, tiny creatures are moving through it like it's a vast landscape.
And if you zoom in, even more.
The scale just collapses. A speck of leaf becomes a mountain range. A drop of water is a three-dimensional swamp.
And the specialization we saw with the sloth moth gets even crazier down here. He talks about a parasitic fungus, Haftoglossa mirabilis. It hunts these tiny animals called rotifers.
And this is pure science fiction. The fungus grows in a tax cell that is literally shaped like a gun. It has a barrel and an explosive base, and when it smells a rotifer go by, it fires a projectile of tissue into it.
It's a microscopic heat-seeking missile.
Basically, yeah. A silent microscopic explosion. The fungus grows inside, new spores burst out, and the cycle starts again.
The level of complexity needed to evolve something like that is just staggering.
And he actually quantifies it. He talks about information measured in bits. A single bacterium holds about 10 million bits of information.
Which is already a lot. But what about something like an ant?
An insect holds between 1 and 10 billion bits. Now get this. To put that in perspective, if you were to translate the genetic information in one ant, just one N, into printed English words, that string of text would stretch for over 1,000 miles.
Wow. 1,000 miles from one single ant. So the real frontier isn't in outer space. It's right here under our feet.
It is. The zoologist Karl von Frisch said the honeybee is like a magic well. The more you draw from it, the more there is to draw. The waggle dance is just the beginning.
Let's quickly explain the dance. The bee comes back, does a figure eight. The length of the middle part is the distance, and the angle tells the other bees which way to fly relative to the sun.
It's a symbolic language,
Mhm.
but understanding that dance just leads you deeper. Into the bee's nervous system, its cells, its molecules, its lineage goes back 50 million years. The journey just never ends.
And Wilson makes it clear we're just at the beginning of that journey. Biologists used to think there were maybe 3 to 10 million species on Earth.
But that number is way off. It's much higher. And that's because we've finally started exploring the last great frontier, the tropical rainforest canopy.
The sea of branches 100 feet up in the air.
Mm-hmm. And using new tools, rope catwalks, insecticide foggers, they're finding incredible diversity up there. Terry Irwin's work suggests there might be as many as 30 million species of insects in the world.
30 million. So the vast majority of life on this planet is still undiscovered, still without a name.
And that leads to Wilson's final point. If we know so little about them, how can we possibly know ourselves? He says our biggest problems come from the fact that we do not know what we are and do not agree on what we want to become.
So here's where it gets really interesting. He concludes that the diversity of life is the frontier the human spirit was built for. The naturalist's curiosity isn't a weird hobby. It's a specialized version of the biophilic instinct that we all share.
The solution to the machine in the garden isn't to destroy the machine, it's to use the knowledge it gives us to go deeper into the garden. That's the exploration we were made for.
So what does this all mean? The big takeaway from Bernhardsdorp is that humanity is special, not because we're above other creatures, but because knowing them, really knowing them, elevates the whole idea of life itself, and realizing that we are designed for this search, that's the real start of the journey.